The sky was the color of an old bruise. Snow began to fall, not clean and white, but like ash from a world that had already burned down. The land was quiet, holding its breath under the weight of the coming storm. This was northern New Mexico, a place of sharp rocks and long memories, where the wind sounded like ghosts whispering through the cottonwoods. Deep in a hollow, tucked away from any road, a thin line of smoke climbed from a broken chimney. It was a stubborn little prayer against the cold. Inside a small cabin, a man sat shirtless before the fire. His name was Taza Grey Wolf. Firelight slid across the scars on his back, mapping out old pain like rivers on dry earth. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself, silent and hard. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind scratching at the door, wanting in. Then he heard it. Taza's head lifted, sharp and sudden, like a wolf sensing something wrong deep in the ground. It wasn't the wind. It was a cry, thin and torn apart by the gusts. He went perfectly still, listening. Another sound came, a frantic little knock, like a bird trapped in a box, and then a voice, so faint it was barely there at all. "Please, help." He was on his feet in a single motion. The leather strap he'd been mending fell to the dirt floor, forgotten. He crossed the cabin and threw the heavy door open. The cold slapped him, a physical blow that stung his eyes. Through the swirling chaos of snow, he saw a figure. A little girl, no taller than his waist, standing barefoot in the snow. Her skin was the color of copper dust, her hair a tangled mess of black and frost. Her deerskin wrap was in tatters, one shoulder bare and smeared with drying blood. She looked up at him, and her eyes were all wrong for a child. They were ancient, full of a pain that should take a lifetime to earn. She swayed on her feet. He took a step toward her, and she collapsed into his arms. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. She weighed nothing, just a bundle of bones and a fragile, fading warmth. He laid her gently on the hide blankets by the fire. From the darkest corner of the cabin, a voice like rustling leaves spoke. "You bring death into this house, my son." It was Nausea, his mother's sister. Her eyes were clouded white with age, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. She sat wrapped in blankets, a blind queen in a kingdom of shadows. Taza didn't answer her. He poured warm water into a bowl, his hands surprisingly gentle. He felt for the pulse in the girl's neck. It was a frantic little flutter, like a trapped moth. "She's alive," he murmured. Nausea tilted her head toward the sound. For now. He began to clean the blood from the girl's shoulder. Underneath the grime, her skin was a nightmare of bruises, purple and black like crushed berries. There were long, thin welts on her arms, the kind a rope makes. A muscle in Taza's jaw jumped, a flicker of something dangerous. His hands, though, remained soft. The child stirred, her lips parting. She whispered something. He had to lean in close to hear it. They beat me," she breathed. "Mama tried to stop them." Her voice cracked. "They said we don't belong here." Taza's throat felt tight, like it was closing up. "Who did this?" "White men," she whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "3 of them. They took Mama. They laughed when I ran." She turned her face into the blanket, and her small body began to shake with silent sobs. Nausea's blind eyes seemed to see everything. Another orphan of their greed. The fire popped loudly, as if in agreement. The wind howled outside, a hungry sound. Taza dipped a cloth in the water and laid it on the girl's forehead. Her skin was burning. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Ayana." Her eyes opened again, just a slit, and a single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "Mama says it means eternal blossom. But I think I'm dying." The words hit Taza like a physical blow. He stood up and threw another log on the fire. watching the sparks fly up the chimney like angry prayers. He went to a shelf and took down a pot of his aunt's herbs, sage, bear root, the things she used to fight off death. Nausea made a small, knowing sound. So the soldier remembers the healer's ways. I remember, he said, and the word soldier felt like ash in his mouth. He'd been a soldier once, a scout for the very men who now hunted his people. He'd guided them, trusted their promises. And in return, they'd burned his world to the ground. He'd lost everyone. Since that day, his silence had been a wall to keep the world out. Ayana's small hand suddenly grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were like cold twigs. Are you a spirit? She whispered, her eyes wide with fever. He looked down at her. No, just a man. She seemed to accept that. Her grip loosened, and she drifted into a restless sleep. The storm raged. Snow piled up against the windows, and the little cabin groaned under the weight. Taza sat by the bed, the firelight dancing on his scarred skin. He watched the girl, and he thought of the men she'd described, men who hunted Apaches for sport, who saw the land as something to be conquered, not lived with. He knew them. He knew the hate in their eyes. He also knew the law wouldn't touch them. The deputy in town was a man named Morton. He might make a show of it, but he wouldn't cross his own kind for an Apache child. But something inside Taza, something he thought he'd buried long ago, was beginning to stir. It wasn't just anger. It was an old, familiar grief, the kind that remembers every face, every name. Nausea began to hum, a low, ancient song that felt as old as the mountains. This child is a sign, she said, her voice clear in the roaring silence. The ancestors send us what we must face. Taza stared at the boarded-up window. I have faced enough. Then why did you open the door? She asked. He had no answer for that. He sat with the girl all night. Her fever climbed, and she cried out for her mother in her sleep. He bathed her face, listened to her ragged breaths, and stood guard against the darkness. He felt himself drifting, caught between waking and a dream he couldn't escape. A dream of fire. The fire that took his family. He saw their faces, heard their screams swallowed by the roar of rifles. He woke with a start, sweat cold on his chest. Ayana was looking at him. Her hand was resting on his. I saw her, she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Mama, she's in the dark. I think she's still there. He leaned closer. Where, Ayana? Where is she? The trading post, she said, her breath catching. The one by the river bend. It has a red sign. He knew the place. Jonas Reeves' post. It was a cesspool where men traded liquor, lies, and lives. A place with no law but greed. Rest, he told her, his voice rougher than he intended. You're safe now. A tiny heartbreaking smile touched her lips. Will you get her? Taza looked into the fire. It writhed and twisted, speaking a language of its own. He saw faces in the flames, promises broken, debts unpaid. He felt the weight of the little girl's question, the impossible hope in it. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. Yes. From the corner, Nausea's voice was like a shard of ice. You will only bring more death if you go. Maybe, Taza said, his gaze fixed on the fire. But the storm has already brought one to my door. The old woman fell silent. The rest of the night passed in a heavy quiet, broken only by the dying storm. Before dawn, the wind eased. Taza rose, frost clinging to his beard. He stepped outside into a world made new. The broken land was buried under a blanket of pure, untouched white. It was beautiful, a beautiful lie. Peace, built on a foundation of silence, can feel just like a grave. He looked toward the valley. He could just make out a thin trail of smoke in the distance. The trading post. It was too far. Way too far for a child to have walked alone in that storm. She must have been guided by something. Pain, or maybe a different kind of fire. As he turned to go back inside, Nausia's voice floated through the open door. "If you go, go as a healer, not as a killer." He didn't answer. He couldn't make a promise he knew he wouldn't keep. He saddled his Mustang, the horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. As he put his foot in the stirrup, he froze. A sound, distant but clear in the new silence, the jingle of a harness, the ring of a horseshoe on stone. He looked up, his eyes scanning the far ridge, and he saw them. 3 dark figures on horseback, moving against the white snow. Even from this distance, he could see the arrogance in the way they rode, like kings of this broken land. They were the men she'd described. He knew it in his bones. They were coming down into his valley. He went back inside, and the air was suddenly thick, hard to breathe. Nausicaa sensed it. "What did you see?" "Ghosts," he said, his voice flat. "Not ghosts," she whispered back. "Men without souls just look that way from a distance." In the bed, Ayana stirred. "They're coming," she whimpered. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "Sleep." But he knew she was right. They weren't just coming. They were hunting. He walked to the window and looked out through a crack in the boards. The riders were closer now, following the frozen creek. His creek. The years of peace he had tried to build for himself were shattering like ice under a hammer. His old life, the one of violence and rage he had buried, was clawing its way back to the surface. The door rattled. The wind, or maybe something else. Nausicaa began to sing again. A low, powerful chant. A prayer for a battle that had already begun. Taza's eyes burned, not with grief anymore, but with a cold, clear purpose. Ayana's voice, small but fierce, came from the bed. "You'll save her, won't you?" Words felt useless. He turned from the window, walked to a dusty chest in the corner, and pulled out an old leather bundle. He unrolled it on the floor. Inside was a long, heavy knife, its edge still sharp. He began tying the leather sheath to his thigh. Outside, the snow started falling again, thick and heavy, as if the sky itself wanted to hide what was about to happen. He pulled the door open. A blast of wind and snow rushed in. He heard Ayana's small cry, half fear, half hope. He looked back one last time. His shadow filled the doorway, a giant against the storm. Then he stepped out into the white. Far across the valley, the 3 riders laughed, their voices carried on the wind. They were tracking a little girl. They didn't know that a ghost was rising from the snow to meet them. The 3 riders moved with a lazy confidence, letting their horses pick their way down the snowy slope. They thought they were hunters, but they were the prey. They just didn't know it yet. Taza moved through the trees, silent as the falling snow. He was a part of this land, and it hid him, protected him. He watched them from a rise. The leader was a big man with a red beard, a rifle resting easy across his saddle. The other 2 were younger, jumpy, their eyes constantly scanning the trees. They were looking for a trail, for a sign of the little girl. They weren't looking for him. That was their first mistake. It would be their last. He let them pass. He knew where they were going. They would follow the creek up to the hollow, up to his cabin, up to Ayana. He had to stop them here, now, before they got any closer. He circled around behind them, a phantom in the woods. The snow muffled every sound. He moved from tree to tree, closing the distance. The man with the red beard reined in his horse, pointing. "Smoke!" he growled. "Up there! Must be the place." The other 2 grinned. They thought the hunt was over. Taza drew his knife. The cold steel felt familiar in his hand, like a part of him he'd forgotten. He took the man in the rear first. He was on him before the man could even turn, one hand covering his mouth, the knife sliding quick and deep. There was no sound, just a sudden stillness. The man slumped in his saddle. The second rider felt something was wrong. He turned, his eyes wide. He saw Taza, a blur of motion and vengeance, and his mouth opened to scream. The scream never came. Taza's knife found its home. 2 down, 1 to go. The leader, Redbeard, heard the thud of the body falling into the snow. He spun his horse around, his rifle coming up. But Taza was no longer there. He had melted back into the trees. "Show yourself, you coward!" Redbeard roared, his voice echoing in the silent valley. Taza didn't answer. He let the man's fear build. He let the silence and the snow become his allies. He could see the man's eyes darting around, fear turning his arrogance to dust. Redbeard fired his rifle blindly into the trees. The shot cracked through the quiet, and a shower of snow fell from a branch. Taza used the sound to move. He burst from the cover of a thick pine, not at the man, but at his horse. He slammed the butt of his knife into the horse's flank. The animal screamed and reared, throwing Redbeard from the saddle. The big man landed hard in the snow. His rifle flew from his grasp. He scrambled to his feet, pulling a pistol from his belt, his face a mask of fury and shock. Taza stood before him, knife in hand, his chest bare to the cold. The falling snow seemed to part around him. "Who the hell are you?" Redbeard spat. "I'm the man whose peace you just broke," Taza said, his voice low and cold as the iron in his hand. Redbeard fired. The shot went wide, the sound swallowed by the thick blanket of snow. Before he could fire again, Taza was on him. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Quick, brutal, and silent. He stood over the 3 bodies, his breath coming in white clouds. He felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret, just a vast, cold emptiness. He had killed to protect his solitude, and in doing so, he had shattered it forever. He knew what he had to do next. This wasn't over. These men were just the dogs. The master was still waiting at the trading post. He didn't take one of their horses. He walked back to his cabin, the blood on his knife freezing in the cold air. When he stepped inside, Nausea was chanting, her voice a low hum. Ayana was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide. She looked at the blood on his hands, on his chest, but she wasn't afraid. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "They're gone," he said. He walked to the basin and began to wash the blood away. "My mama," she said, her voice trembling. "Is she—" "I'm going now," he said, not looking at her. He couldn't look at the hope in her eyes. It was too heavy a burden. He pulled on a shirt and his hide coat. He checked the edge of his knife. He was a soldier again, a warrior. The healer was gone, buried under the snow. Nausea stopped her chanting. "The path you walk now has no return," she said. "There was never a path back," he answered. He turned to leave. "Wait!" Ayana cried out. She held out a small, grimy object. It was a piece of carved wood, a small bird with a broken wing. "Mama made it for me, for luck." He took it from her. The wood was warm from her hand. He tucked it inside his coat. He mounted his Mustang and rode out, not looking back. The snow was falling harder now, a true blizzard. The world was disappearing into a swirl of white. The storm would hide his tracks. The storm was his ally. The ride to the river bend was a battle against the wind and the cold. He hunched low over the horse's neck, the world a blur around him. The little wooden bird seemed to press against his chest, a small point of warmth in the freezing world. He thought about the girl, Ayana, eternal blossom, a flower trying to grow in a world of ice and stone. He thought about her mother, a woman he'd never met, a woman chained in the dark. He had made a promise. In his old life, his promises had turned to smoke. This time would be different. This time, his promise would be forged in blood and steel. As he got closer to the trading post, the smell of wood smoke and cheap whiskey cut through the clean scent of the snow. He could hear faint sounds from within, drunken laughter. A woman's cry, quickly silenced. His jaw tightened. He dismounted, leaving his horse in a stand of snow-heavy pines. He moved toward the barn at the back of the post, a shadow in the storm. He peered through a crack in the wall. The scene inside was bathed in the greasy yellow light of a lantern. Jonas Reeves, a fat, wheezing man with a stained shirt, was standing over a woman huddled in the straw. It had to be Sahal, Ayana's mother. She was chained to a post, her face bruised and swollen. Two other men were there, drinking and laughing. One of them idly cracked a whip against his boot. "She's a fighter, this one," the man with the whip said with a chuckle. "Her brat got away, though. Probably frozen stiff by now." Reeves kicked at the woman in the straw. "Doesn't matter. This one knows what we want to know. She'll talk. They all talk in the end." A cold rage, clean and pure, settled over Taza. He slipped the knife from its sheath. The door to the barn was barred from the inside, but the wall was old, the wood rotten in places. He found a loose board and began to work it free, slowly, silently. The wind covered the sound. He was inside. He moved like a panther, a whisper of death in the dusty barn. The man with the whip was the first to die. He never even saw it coming. The knife was a flash of silver in the lantern light. The second man turned, his jaw dropping open. He reached for his gun, but Taza was too fast. He drove the man back against the wall, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. The fight was over before it began. Now it was just him and Reeves. The fat trader stared at him, his eyes wide with terror. Sweat beaded on his forehead. What are you?" he stammered, fumbling for the pistol tucked in his belt. Taza stepped into the light, the snow melting on his shoulders. "I'm a promise," he said softly. Reeves managed to pull his gun free. He fired, the sound deafening in the small space. The bullet tore through the flesh of Taza's arm, a hot line of pain. He didn't even flinch. He closed the distance in 2 long strides and drove his knife into the trader's side. Reeves gasped, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed into the straw. The barn was suddenly silent, except for the sound of the wind and the soft sobs of the woman on the floor. He knelt beside her, cutting the chain with a single sharp twist of his blade. "Ayana sent me," he said. Her head snapped up. Hope, fierce and unbelievable, flared in her eyes. "My daughter? She's alive?" "She's safe," he said. He helped her to her feet, wrapping his own cloak around her shivering shoulders. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though she could barely stand. "I can try." He half-carried her out of the barn and into the raging storm. He lifted her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her, holding her steady. As they turned to leave, he looked back at the barn. The lantern Reeves had dropped was now burning brightly in the straw. Good, he thought. Let it all burn. They rode into the heart of the blizzard, the fire at their backs lighting up the sky. The flames were a beacon, a signal. He knew it would draw attention. He knew the fight was far from over. But as he felt Sahal's warmth against his chest, as they rode toward the mountains, toward her daughter, he felt something else, too. Something that had been frozen inside him for years was beginning to thaw. It felt like hope. The storm was a wall of white, a screaming, clawing thing that wanted to pull them from the horse and bury them. Taza rode on, guided by a map etched into his memory. He held Sahal tight, her body limp against his. The bullet wound in his arm was a dull, throbbing fire, but he ignored it. Pain was an old friend. "They will come for us," Sahal whispered, her voice ragged. "I know." "You should have left me," she said, her words lost in the wind. "You could have gotten away." He didn't answer. He just spurred the horse onward, deeper into the mountains, toward the high passes where the world was made of stone and sky. The fire from the trading post was long gone, swallowed by the storm. But he knew what it meant. A fire like that was an alarm bell. Men would come, lawmen, and others. Men who had a stake in whatever secrets Jonas Reeves had been keeping. They found shelter in a shallow cave, a crack in the rock face that offered some protection from the wind. He helped Sahal down from the horse. Her legs gave out, and he caught her, her weight surprisingly light in his arms. He built a small fire, the flames struggling for life in the damp air. In the flickering light, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Her face was a mess of cuts and bruises. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the chains. But her eyes were alive. They were full of a fire that even Reeves and his men couldn't put out. "You killed them all," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He tended to the wound in his arm, tearing a strip from his shirt to bind it. "Do you regret it?" He looked at her, and a flicker of something passed between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to be hunted. "No," he said, "but I will pay for it." She watched him for a long moment. "You fight like a man who has already died once." "Maybe I have," he said, his voice low. "The world just forgot to bury me." A small ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My daughter will like you." "She already does," he replied. He cleaned her wounds as best he could with melted snow. As he worked, he noticed something. A brand on her shoulder, hidden beneath her torn dress. It was a strange symbol, a snake eating its own tail. He'd seen it before, years ago, on the saddlebags of the army officer who had betrayed him, the man who had given the order to burn his village, Colonel Vance. A cold dread washed over him. This wasn't about a random act of cruelty. This wasn't about a stolen woman. This was about him, about his past. Vance was here, and he was involved in this. Before he could speak, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, the sound of many horses moving at a steady pace. Sahal's eyes widened in fear. "They found us." He put out the fire with a handful of snow, plunging the cave into darkness. He moved to the entrance, peering out into the swirling white. He could see them now. A line of riders, their lanterns swinging in the wind, creating dancing, monstrous shadows on the snow. At the front was a man with a silver badge pinned to his coat, Deputy Clay Morton. Taza knew him. Morton was a man who tried to walk the line between law and justice, and usually failed at both. But behind him were other men, hard-faced men who didn't look like lawmen. They looked like soldiers, or mercenaries. And at the very back, on a big black horse, sat a man whose face was burned into Taza's memory. Colonel Vance. This wasn't a posse. It was an army, and they hadn't found him by chance. They had been led here. But how? Then he knew. The little wooden bird. Ayanna had said it was for luck. But it wasn't. He pulled it from his coat. In the faint light from the snow outside, he saw it. A tiny piece of metal embedded in the wood. A tracker. Vance had planted it on the girl, knowing she would run, knowing she would lead him to whoever gave her shelter. It was all a trap. And he had walked right into it. "Stay here," he whispered to Sahal. "Don't make a sound." He stepped out of the cave, his hands held open at his sides. He would face them. He would not hide. The riders stopped. Morton rode forward, his face grim. "Grey Wolf," he said, his voice heavy. "It's over. Give us the woman." "She's not yours to take," Taza said, his eyes fixed on the man behind Morton, on Vance. The colonel rode forward, a cruel smile on his face. "Taza Grey Wolf, the ghost of the mountains. I heard you were dead." "You heard wrong," Taza said. "It seems I did," Vance said. "No matter. I'll correct the mistake myself. Now give me the woman. She has something that belongs to me." "She has nothing," Taza said. Vance laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Oh, she does. She knows the location of the old silver mine, the one her people have guarded for generations, and she is going to tell me where it is." So that was it. Not just land, not just hate. Greed. The oldest story of them all. "She will tell you nothing," Taza said. "We'll see about that," Vance said. He nodded to his men. "Take him." The mercenaries started to move forward, rifles raised. Morton hesitated. Taza could see the conflict in the deputy's eyes. The man knew this was wrong, but he was outmanned and outgunned. "Morton," Taza said, his voice low but carrying in the wind. "You have a choice to make." Before the deputy could answer, Sahal appeared at the mouth of the cave. She held a rifle in her hands, one she must have taken from one of Reeves's dead men. It was pointed directly at Vance. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice shaking but strong. Vance just smiled. "Foolish girl. You'll die with him." He raised his hand to give the signal to fire, and in that split second, Taza moved. He wasn't aiming for Vance or his men. He threw his knife, a spinning blur of steel, not at a person, but at the snow-laden cliff face high above them. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groaning roar, the avalanche began. A wall of snow, a white tidal wave, thundered down the mountainside, straight toward Vance and his men. There were screams, the panicked whinny of horses. The world dissolved into a chaos of white. Taza grabbed Sahal and pulled her back, deep into the cave, as the snow crashed down, burying everything in its path. When the roaring stopped, there was only silence. A deep, profound silence. The world outside the cave was gone, replaced by a solid wall of snow. They were trapped, buried alive. But they were alive, for now. The darkness inside the cave was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. The only sound was their own breathing, ragged and loud in the sudden tomb-like silence. The air was cold and thin, already tasting of stone and dust. "Are you hurt?" Taza's voice came out of the black, low and steady. It was an anchor in the nothingness. "No," Sahal whispered back. He could hear the tremor in her voice. "You saved me. Again." "We're not saved yet," he said. "We're buried." He felt her move closer, her shoulder brushing against his, a small, human warmth in the crushing cold. "What do we do?" "We wait for the air to run out," he said, his voice flat. Then, after a beat, he added, "Or we dig." He could almost feel her small smile in the dark. "Then we dig." He had his knife. It wasn't much, but it was something. He began to scrape at the wall of snow that blocked the cave entrance. It was packed hard, dense as rock. For every handful he clawed away, more seemed to settle in its place. It was hopeless. He knew it was hopeless. But he kept digging. To stop digging was to accept death, and he wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. They worked in silence for what felt like hours. His wounded arm ached with a fiery intensity. His muscles screamed in protest. But he kept going, driven by a stubborn refusal to give up. Sahal worked beside him, her small hands scooping away the snow he loosened. They were a team, two souls fighting against a mountain. As he worked, he thought about Vance. Had the avalanche killed him? It was possible. But Vance was a survivor. A snake. Taza had a feeling he was still out there, somewhere on the other side of this wall of white waiting. And Morton? What had happened to the deputy? Had he been buried too? Or had he gotten clear? Taza found himself hoping the man had survived. Morton was weak, but he wasn't evil. And in this land, that was a rare thing. His knife struck something hard. Not rock, wood. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He felt around in the darkness, his fingers tracing a rough, splintered surface. A log, part of a tree that had been swept up in the avalanche. It was wedged in the snow, creating a small pocket of space, and beyond it, a draft. A tiny, almost imperceptible current of fresh, cold air. "There's a way out," he said, his voice hoarse. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in his chest. They worked with a renewed frenzy, digging around the log, pulling at the branches. It was slow, exhausting work. The log was heavy, wedged tight. It wouldn't budge. "It's no use," Sahal said, her voice filled with despair. "Yes, it is," Taza said, his voice a low growl. "Get back!" He braced himself, his feet digging into the floor of the cave. He put his good shoulder against the log and pushed. He pushed with every ounce of strength he had left. He pushed with the memory of the fire, the memory of Ayana's face, the memory of a promise he had to keep. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting wood and shifting snow, the log moved. Just an inch, but it was enough. A sliver of pale light cut through the darkness. They scrambled through the opening, out into a changed world. The sun was high in the sky, glinting off a sea of white. The avalanche had completely reshaped the canyon. Where there had been a creek and a stand of pines, there was now just a vast, smooth blanket of snow. There was no sign of Vance or his men, no sign of the horses. It was as if they had never existed. But as Taza scanned the horizon, he saw it. A thin trail of smoke, rising from a cluster of rocks further down the valley. A campfire. Vance was alive, and he was waiting for them. "He knows we survived," Sahal said, her hand tightening on his arm. "Yes," Taza said, "and he knows we have to go down. There's no other way out of this canyon." They were exposed, trapped. The hunter had become the hunted. They had no horses, no food, and only one knife between them. Vance had guns and men, and all the time in the world. "What do we do now?" Sahal asked, her eyes searching his face. Taza looked up at the sun. He looked at the endless, unforgiving expanse of white, and he looked at the woman beside him, her face bruised but defiant. "Now," he said, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. "We hunt." They moved down the mountain, not like refugees but like predators. Taza taught Sahal how to walk without leaving a trace, how to use the shadows of the rocks for cover, how to listen to the language of the wind. They were two ghosts moving through a white world. The sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. They were getting closer to the campfire. They could hear the voices of men, rough and confident. They could smell the scent of cooking meat. They crept to the edge of a rocky outcrop and looked down. Vance was there, along with 5 of his men. Morton was there too, his hands tied, a bloody gash on his forehead. He was a prisoner. Vance was pacing back and forth in front of the fire, his face a mask of rage. "Find them!" he roared. "They can't have just vanished. I want that woman, and I want Grey Wolf's head on a spike." Taza looked at Sahal. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. A burning resolve. She had been a victim for too long. She was ready to fight back. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed. To a narrow ledge that ran along the cliff face, high above the camp. It was a dangerous path, barely wide enough for one person, but it would take them behind Vance's men. She nodded. She understood. They began the climb. The rock was slick with ice. The wind tore at them, trying to throw them from the ledge. A single misstep would mean a fall of 100 feet to the rocks below. But they kept going, their movements slow, deliberate, and perfectly synchronized. They moved as one. They reached a position directly above the camp. The men below were oblivious, warming their hands by the fire, their rifles leaning against the rocks. It was a perfect trap. Taza pulled the small wooden bird from his coat. Ayana's bird. He looked at it for a moment, then tied a small, sharp shard of rock to it with a strip of leather from his boot. He whispered to Sahal, "When I throw this, scream, as loud as you can." She looked at him, confused, but she nodded. He took aim. He wasn't aiming for a man. He was aiming for the pile of ammunition boxes stacked near the fire. He threw the weighted bird. It flew true, a small, dark arrow in the twilight. It struck the boxes, not with enough force to do damage, but enough to make a sharp, cracking sound. At the same instant, Sahal screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, a woman's scream that echoed off the canyon walls. Vance's men jumped to their feet, grabbing their rifles, spinning around, looking for the source of the sound. They were all looking the wrong way. And that's when Taza and Sahal pushed the loose boulder. It was a huge slab of rock, teetering on the edge of the ledge. They had seen it on their way up. It was perfectly balanced, waiting for just a small push. They put their shoulders to it and heaved. The boulder shifted, groaned, and then tipped over the edge. It fell with a sound like thunder, crashing down directly into the middle of the camp. It shattered the campfire, sending sparks and embers flying in every direction. It crushed 2 of the men instantly. A third was thrown against the rocks, his body broken. Chaos erupted. The remaining men fired their rifles wildly into the darkness. Vance screamed orders that no one could hear over the confusion. In the midst of the chaos, Taza saw Morton. The deputy had managed to get to his feet. He saw his chance. He charged at one of the mercenaries, tackling him to the ground. They rolled over and over, fighting for control of the man's rifle. Taza knew this was their only chance. He and Sahal scrambled down the rocks, using the darkness and the confusion as cover. He moved with a deadly purpose, his knife a blur in the dim light. Another mercenary went down, a silent, gurgling cry his only sound. Now it was just Vance. The colonel stood amidst the wreckage of his camp, his face lit by the dying embers of the fire. He held a pistol in his hand, his eyes wild with fury. He saw Taza coming, and a terrible smile spread across his face. "Grey Wolf," he snarled. "I should have known you wouldn't die so easily." He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a shot rang out. Vance staggered back, a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his chest. Behind him, Morton stood holding a rifle, his face grim. "It's over, Vance." Vance laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "It's never over," he rasped. He turned his pistol, not toward Taza, but toward Sahal. Taza moved faster than he ever had in his life. He threw himself at Sahal, knocking her to the ground, covering her body with his own. The pistol fired. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his back. The world went dark at the edges. He heard Sahal scream his name. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Vance, collapsing to the ground, a final, hateful smirk on his lips. And then, nothing. The first thing he felt was warmth, a gentle, steady warmth on his face. The sun. The first thing he heard was a voice, a small, clear voice, humming a soft tune. He opened his eyes. The world came into focus slowly. He was lying on a bed of soft hides, inside his own cabin. The fire was burning low in the hearth. Sunlight streamed through the open door. Ayana was sitting on the floor beside him, carefully trying to mend the wing of the small wooden bird. She saw he was awake, and her face broke into a huge smile. "You're back," she whispered. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his back forced him down again. "How—" Sahal came into his view, a bowl of steaming broth in her hands. Her face was clean, her hair was brushed. The bruises were fading. She looked beautiful. "Morton brought you back," she said, her voice soft. "He and we carried you. It took 2 days." "Morton?" Taza asked, confused. "He's a good man," Sahal said. "He told the people in town that Vance and his men were killed by bandits. He said he never found any sign of you or me. He gave us a second chance." Taza lay back, trying to process it all. He remembered the pain, the darkness. He remembered thinking he was dead. "You saved my life," he said, looking at Sahal. She shook her head. "No, we saved each other." He looked at the little girl, Ayana, eternal blossom. She was smiling at him, her eyes bright and full of life. He looked at her mother, Sahal, her strength a quiet fire that had warmed him back from the brink of death. He had spent years building walls around his heart. He had embraced the silence, the solitude. He had thought he was protecting himself, but he had only been imprisoning himself. This little girl, this brave woman, they hadn't just brought death and chaos to his door. They had brought him back to life. He reached out his hand and Sahal took it. Her hand was warm and strong. Ayana put her small hand on top of theirs. 3 hands, joined together. A family, forged in fire and snow. Outside, the world was thawing. The snow was melting, and the first green shoots of spring were pushing their way through the cold earth. The land was healing, and so was he. He knew there would still be scars. There would always be scars. But for the first time in a very long time, as he looked at the 2 faces smiling down at him, he felt the promise of peace. A real peace. Not the peace of silence and solitude, but the peace of home. This story is a reminder that even in the darkest of storms, the smallest light can guide you home. If you were moved by Taz's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of survival, justice, and the unbreakable human spirit.